Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our final 2024 webinar. While all of our webinars are memorable, today's webinar will extend a bit beyond the Sefarad legacy and bring much-needed attention to the ageless and ruthless saga of anti-Semitism and accompanying massacres. My name is Michael Steinberger, and I am founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit platform dedicated to research, promote, and preserve the legacy of Sfarad. To be clear, the word Sefarad refers to the Jews that lived and were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, nowadays Spain and Portugal. The effects and consequences of the Sefarad legacy spans time and space, from antiquity to present day, and still enduring and unfolding at present day. In order to expand our reach, we developed a strategic alliance and partners consisting of global organizations, institutions, and individuals covering the private and public sectors that together creates a voice of the collective, thereby amplifying our message. At this time, I would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors that helped make today's presentation possible. I would like to thank the Comunidad Israelita do Porto, or the Jewish Community of Porto in Portugal. I would like to welcome and thank the Dahan Center of Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv. I would also like to thank the Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies and the George Feldenkrais Programs in Judaic Studies at the University of Miami. I would also like to thank and acknowledge our co-hosting partners for helping promote today's event, and they are the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, also in Miami, known as CAGE, Anu Museum of the Jewish People, previously Bet HaTfutzot, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, the European Jewish Community Center, and the Women's International Zionist Organization of Florida, also known as WITZO. Thank you, one and all. To you, our audience, please feel free to contact us should you or your organization wish to sponsor any of our future events. At this time, I would like to introduce His Excellency Danny Danon, the permanent representative of Israel in the United Nations. As you can all imagine, Danny is extremely busy trying to manage the anti-Israeli UN amid rapidly unfolding events. So Danny apologizes that he could not appear in person, but he sends this brief welcoming video. Please play the video.
Shalom. I want to congratulate you for this important gathering, especially this year after October 7th. It's important to remember our history, to remember the persecution of Sephardic Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. I want to welcome you when you start this important convention, and I want to wish you success in the important discussions. The people of Israel are strong. Our enemies thought that they can break us, but they are mistaken. We are strong, we will prevail, and we will win. Good luck, ba'atzlacha. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for your kind words, and especially for the amazing work you do at the UN. And now, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Isaac Amon, the Director of Academic Research at Jewish Heritage Alliance, who will moderate today's event. Welcome, Isaac. Please take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. In the aftermath of October 7th, 2023, the single deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, Jew hatred has been surging around the world, ranging from Australia to Canada, South Africa to the United Kingdom, and Latin America to the United States. Indeed, according to the Anti-Defamation League, in the year since October 7th, more than 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents have occurred in the American Republic. Anti-Semitism is a shadow accompanying Jews on their journeys. Like a virus, it modifies to every age and ideology, but its essence is the same. For example, anti-Judaism in the Middle Ages, anti-Jewish racism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and today's attacks against Israel, the world's only Jewish state. It is shocking to the conscience how deeply it cuts across time and space. Yet amidst this hate and violence, Jewish life has adapted and even thrived, displaying resilience and an unwavering will to live from antiquity to today. In the 2nd century BCE, Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes outlawed Jewish rituals in Judea. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote, Antiochus sacrificed a great swine at the altar of God. He put out the lamp, called by Jews immortal, which burns continually in the temple, and he forced the high priest to eat swine's flesh. The Maccabees, or Hashmonaim, rebelled, restored Jewish sovereignty, and rededicated the temple in Jerusalem. The Talmud adds 1 day's worth of oil kept the menorah burning in the temple for 8 days, forming the holiday of Hanukkah. In antiquity, core rituals, circumcision, Shabbat, and dietary laws, and strong belief in monotheism already distinguished Jews from their pagan neighbors. As the 2nd century Roman historian Tacitus wrote, among Jews, all things are profane that we hold sacred. On the other hand, they regard as permissible what seems to us immoral. In 38 CE, the ancient Jewish community of Alexandria, Egypt, was massacred by Greek and Egyptian mobs. Philo, an eminent Jewish scholar, was a witness, and he described scenes eerily similar to October 7th. Quote, their enemies slew them with all kinds of agony and tortures. The most merciless of all their persecutors, in some instances, burnt whole families, husbands with their wives, and infant children with their parents. In 70 CE, the Second Temple, Beit HaMikdash, was destroyed. The historian and eyewitness Josephus wrote, while the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, nor was there pity for any age. Children, old men, and priests were all slain. Tens of thousands of Jews were taken to Rome, and this march of captives is depicted on the Arch of Titus, which stands today, showing the menorah as a spoil of war. Jewish slaves, it appears, helped build the Colosseum. Other Jewish revolts arose, including Bar Kokhba's, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, who crushed the rebellion and renamed Judea Syria Philistina. Soon thereafter, in emerging Christian theology, Judaism came to be seen as contemptible and even demonic. In 167 CE or so, the first known charge of deicide, all Jews killed Jesus, was made. This claim would not be repudiated by the Catholic Church until 1965. Over time, beginning with the 4th century Roman Emperor Constantine, Jewish rights were revoked, rabbinic jurisdiction restricted, and Jews excluded from society. Under the 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian, synagogues were shuttered in North Africa, the Mishnah could not be studied, and Judaism was stripped of legal protection. In 610 CE Arabia, Islam was born when Muhammad, a camel caravan driver, claimed revelation. In 622, escaping harassment in Mecca, he fled to Medina, where Jews were prominent. While Jews welcomed him, they did not accept his claim to prophethood. By 629, Jews were expelled, enslaved, or killed. Yet as long as they paid a tax, jizya, which made them dhimmis, or second-class subjects, Islam largely tolerated Jews and Christians as people of the book. During this time period, the Jews of Iberia suffered greatly under the Visigothic kings. The Catholic Church forbade marriage between Jews and Christians, and Jewish converts had to renounce their former faith and customs on pain of death. Many were forcibly baptized, becoming crypto-Jews. In 694, Jews aged 6 and older were ordered to be taken from their families and raised as Christians. This persecution came to an end in 711 when Muslims conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, later ushering in the so-called Golden Age of Sefarad from the 10th to 12th centuries. Overall, though, the Middle Ages saw Jews suffer massacres, forced conversions, and expulsions. The abhorrent blood libels, which accused Jews of using Christian children's blood for religious rituals, and the use of the yellow star as a distinctive badge, cemented harmful stereotypes. In 1096, 10,000 Jews in France and Germany, especially the Rhineland, were slaughtered in the First Crusade. In 1391, as the map shows, 50,000 to 100,000 Jews were massacred across Spain. Rouvain, a survivor of the massacre and son of the famous Rabbi Nisim of Gerona, painfully wrote, quote, "It was the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah which overtook the communities of Castile, Toledo, Sevilla, Mallorca, Cordoba, Valencia, Barcelona, and Gerona. Slaughter, forced conversions, and captivity were the order of the day." 15th and 16th century Iberian purity of blood laws, limpieza de sangre statutes, targeted conversos, or Catholic descendants of Jews on the basis that Jewish ancestry tainted one's blood, eerily foreshadowing Nazi obsession with Jewish biology. In 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was created, and in 1492, Spanish Jewry was expelled. Half left for North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the other half went to Portugal. In 1497, Portuguese King Manuel I forcibly baptized the Jewish community in Lisbon, instantly making them conversos, or new Christians. Portugal closed synagogues and schools and seized prayer books and ritual objects. This religiocide, annihilation of a faith, meant Judaism in Sefarad was publicly no more. In April 1506, new Christians in Lisbon were slain, as the film from the Jewish Community of Porto shows. The prelate Geronimo Osorio observed, "The shrieks and outcries of the women, together with the piteous supplications of the men, might have softened the most savage hearts, but the perpetrators are so divested of humanity that they spared neither sex nor age." In 1536, an Inquisition in Portugal was created. In 1648, a Cossack uprising occurred in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry. Hundreds of Jewish communities were annihilated. Nathan ben Moses Hanover, an eyewitness, described horrific violence in words nearly impossible to read, saying, quote, "Jews died cruel and bitter deaths. Some were skinned alive. Some had limbs chopped off. Some women had their bellies torn open and live cats placed in them." By the 17 and 1800s, age of revolutions and enlightenment, faith had markedly declined, but anti-Semitism mutated, and Jews were seen as racially distinct. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish army captain, was suspected of spying for Germany. Evidence of innocence was suppressed, and he was convicted of treason. Publicly stripped of his rank, where a mob cried, "Mort le Juif," kill the Jew, he was sentenced to life in prison on Devil's Island in French Guiana. 12 years later, the French president pardoned him. Theodor Herzl, a young journalist, saw the mob chanting against Dreyfus. In 1897, at the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, he jotted in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will recognize this." In 1947, 50 years later, the UN formally recognized a Jewish state. Centuries of anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust. As the late Raoul Hilberg, a Shoah historian, put it, since Constantine in the 4th century CE, there have been 3 principal anti-Jewish policies. The missionaries of Christianity had said, in effect, "You have no right to live among us as Jews." The monarchs who followed proclaimed, "You have no right to live among us." And the Nazis at last decreed, "You have no right to live." In other words, conversion, expulsion, annihilation. In the mid-20th century, following the Shoah and birth of the State of Israel, 850,000 Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews were expelled from countries across North Africa and the Middle East, places they had lived for millennia. From Yemen to Tunisia, Afghanistan to Syria, where my own grandmother was born and grew up, and Iraq to Libya, Jews have nearly vanished, and all that remain are memories. In the 76 years since the nation state of the Jewish people was reborn, it has been subjected to delegitimization, demonization, and double standards, to invoke Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. And in its most pernicious form, anti-Zionism invokes traditional anti-Semitic tropes. It denies millennia of continuous Jewish connection to the land of Israel, as attested to by history, memory, archaeology, theology, and liturgy. And as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself said shortly before his assassination, in 1968, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, anti-Semitism, as we all know, has impacted Ashkenazim, Mizrahim, and Sephardim. October 7th and the global tsunami of Jew hatred did not happen in a vacuum, for anti-Semitism is not only part of our collective past, but continues to shape the world today. As Simon Dubnow, a 20th century Jewish historian murdered by the Nazis, profoundly and poignantly observed, every generation in Israel carries within itself the remnants of worlds created and destroyed during the course of the history of the Jewish people. And that generation in turn continues to weave the thread that binds all the links of the nation into the chain of generations. While it casts a giant shadow, anti-Semitism does not define Jews or Judaism. And as we usher in Hanukkah 5785, 10 days from now, we will recall the miracles of old and light menorahs to dispel this darkness, and remember that we retain the indomitable spirit of our ancestors and the 2,000-year-old hope, hatikvah, that the Jewish people's best days still lay ahead. And it is now my privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce today's first presenter, Ms. Dara Jeffries, the Vice President of the Jewish Community of Porto, which earlier this year released a short film entitled 1506, the Lisbon Genocide. And with the global surge of anti-Semitism and eerie parallels to October 7th, it's quite timely. And so to provide us with an overview of the film, I turn it over to Dara.
Thank you, Isaac. As mentioned, my name is Dara Jeffries, and I am the Vice President of the Jewish Community of Porto. And that's the committee that researched and produced the film 1506 that is the focus of today's discussions. At the end of the presentations and panel discussions, we will provide a trailer and links to the film so you can watch it in the entirety. So I urge you to check it out. As some of you know, this is not the first film production of the Jewish Community of Porto. It also produced the acclaimed film 1618 that's distributed by Golden, and it's available on Amazon, about the Inquisition to the city of Oporto. Another production was the film Sefardic, which is also available on the internet. And that recounts the history of the community, which is celebrated last year at Centennial. And it focused on its first president, Captain Baros Basto, who achieved the incredible feat of building the largest synagogue in the Iberian Peninsula, the Kaduri Synagogue, in 1938, the eve of World War II, under a fascist regime when synagogues around the world were being burned. So the idea of the film came about well before October 7th, because we wanted the world to know about this little known but hugely important historical event. But October 7th was the catalyst that spurred the community into getting it produced in record time. The massacre in 1506 was a genocide of enormous proportions, completely forgotten, and that very few people, even within Portugal, even know about. And we believe that movies are a unique way to tell a story and to educate. So for us, it was important to make this film and make sure it is seen. It's available for everyone for free for that reason. During the 1506 massacre, more than 3,000 people were massacred in the space of a couple of days. And incredibly, hardly anybody knows about this story. But it's really important that we learn from history. The pogroms and attacks against Jews have occurred every generation in every country, as Dr. Isaac has shown. And yet each time it's as though it was the first time. It's like this never happened before, but it has. And it's vital that not only Jews, but everyone knows that such events begin with conspiracy theories and hate speech that turn into violence and murder. The film goes into some detail and has some visual elements that can be disturbing, but we kept it very short to fit 20 minutes because of that. However, these elements are necessary to really understand the barbarism and the barbaric nature of what occurred. All the scenes are based on real events and historical research from contemporary sources, such as Garcia Reséndez, Salomón Vega, and Andrés Bernaldez. The script was written by our Historical Research Center with the support of the Sephardic Studies Department of the University of Lisbon. So you will note, not only from Dr. Isaac's introduction, but as you see the film as well, that there's a thread that connects the events depicted in the film and October 7th. The sheer hatred and barbarism, as well as the conspiracy theories that stoke the flames, both real and figurative, of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is known as the longest hatred and has been fueled by conspiracy theories for millennia. And this is depicted in the film. In the film, we see Jews blamed for natural disasters such as the plague and drought, and they were targets of hatred because of their positions of power and wealth and their roles as tax collectors, moneylenders, and favored by the king. The monarchs employed Jews and found them useful. So even Dom Manuel, when he ordered the expulsion of Jews and the prohibition of the practice of Judaism in Portugal in 1496, to please the Spanish kings, really didn't want them to leave and even burned their ships to prevent them from leaving. He really preferred that they stayed and at least pretend to convert. But to the Catholic Church, those converts were not true Christians, and therefore the focus of their hatred. So you will see that in the film, that there's a difference in attitude between the Dominican friars and the monarchy. The difference is quite stark. To be clear, and I do want to say this, the community today has an excellent record and relationship with the Catholic Church, and in particular with the bishop of Porto, who's been extremely supportive and has joined the community in many charitable missions. In fact, we received a beautiful letter also from the Pope, which I'm proud to say, because we sent him a short film we had made called The Nun's Kaddish, and he liked it very much and wrote us a letter of appreciation. But anti-Semitism has been on the rise, and our response to it has been to educate and demystify. And the Jewish Community of Porto feels that its mission is to create the conditions for Jewish life to thrive in Portugal. And to do that, it's important that the Portuguese population is receptive and educated about Judaism and about their own Jewish history and identity. So we built several Jewish institutions in the city, including a Jewish museum and a Holocaust museum. And apart from all the other historical facts, we also show our films there. More than 200,000 students have visited our museums. That's about 15% of the Portuguese teenage student population. We also annually mark European Day of Culture with open doors to the public in all our facilities and many activities and lectures. That's how we believe we can gain appreciation for Jewish culture rather than persecution. So I thank you for your interest in our film, and I thank Michael and his team at JHA. And I now pass you back to Isaac to begin the presentations.
Thank you very much, Dara, for sharing your thoughts today, and a very special thank you to the Jewish Community of Porto for all your work in shining light on anti-Semitism and Jewish history in Portugal and the broader Iberian context, and really for all your collaborative efforts as well with JHA, including co-sponsoring previous webinars and today's event. And so with this, it is now my honor to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Shimon Ochaiyun, Director of the Dahan Center at Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv, who will briefly speak on the legacy of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa and their expulsions in the 20th century. Dr. Ochaiyun, the floor is yours.
At the beginning of my remarks, I would like to thank Mr. Michael Steinberger, founder and director of the Jewish Heritage Alliance, for organizing this important meeting. Thank you to the ambassador to the UN, the Israeli ambassador, Mr. Dani Danon. Thank you also to all the organizations partnering in this event. I would like to concentrate on the Arab false propaganda, the pro-Palestinian propaganda talking about ethnic cleansing. And I'm going to elaborate and to see that, and to tell ourselves also that maybe if we were aware of the history of the Jewish communities in the Arab countries, maybe we could reduce the influence of the propaganda by the pro-Palestinians. For many years, the educational and social systems in Israel and abroad neglected to tell the story of Jewish communities that lived in Arab countries and were eliminated through a process that ultimately led to total ethnic cleansing. Even before the October 7 events and Hamas murderous attack on Southern communities in Israel, we witnessed pro-Palestinian students dominating campus activities worldwide, flooding institution after institution with anti-Israeli propaganda. Not only did Jewish students have no response, but some even identified with and joined the pro-Palestinians, all carrying the flag of protest against Israel, accusing it of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and Arabs in Israel. The false propaganda grows stronger. However, as mentioned, there was no response in matter of fact or attempt to deal with this false propaganda, when in fact the only cleansing that occurred was the ethnic cleansing of the Jews from Arab countries, who were persecuted and suffered severely from pogroms, citizenship revocation, and property nationalization, in which around $200 billion of property was left in the Arab countries. Nearly 1 million Jews who lived there left Arab countries with Israelis when Israel state was established. Jewish communities that lived there for 2,000 years were eliminated, and out of about 1 million Jews, only a few thousand remained in some Arab countries. This is ethnic cleansing as fact, not false propaganda. On the other side, only 150,000 Arabs lived in Israel 1948 by the establishment of the State of Israel. And now we have 2.2 million Arabs living in the country. But to our regret, for many years, education and social systems in Israel and abroad did not bother to tell the story of Jewish communities that lived in Arab countries and were eliminated through a process that ultimately led to total ethnic cleansing. Entire generations in Israel and in Jewish diaspora grew up without knowledge of awareness of the suffering and sacrifice of Jews from Arab countries following Israel's establishment. And we never heard voices of protest or demonstrations in Israel or in other countries, in other Jewish also communities in the world and worldwide, against the ethnic cleansing of Jews in Arab countries. This failure is twofold. On one hand, the story of Jews from Arab countries and their great suffering.
Apologies, Dr. Ochayoun. I hope you can rejoin us. Our second panelist is Mr. Richard Zimler, a dear friend and colleague, personally, and of Jewish Heritage Alliance, an award-winning novelist. He has written on Jewish memory and culture, most famously on Portuguese Jewish history. His first novel, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, published in 1996, is directly set amidst the 1506 massacre in Lisbon. And with that, Richard, I turn it over to you.
Welcome to everyone who's joining us on the internet. I'm speaking to you from northern Portugal today, and I'm going to talk about the Lisbon Massacre of 1506. The bloodshed began on April 19th, 1506, during secret Passover celebrations. And why were they secret? And what were the consequences of this pogrom? I'm going to tell you about that and answer those questions, but first I need to give you a very brief summary of Portuguese Jewish history. There's the strange idea out there that all the Portuguese Jews actually originated in Spain and came when Ferdinand and Isabella kicked them out in 1492. This is completely false. Jews have lived in Portugal since Roman times. Those of you who remember your Roman history know that Jews participated actively in Roman colonization and the Roman Empire, and we had two provinces here in Portugal belonging to Rome, Galicia in the north and Lusitania in the south. And when Rome fell to the German tribes in the 5th century, and Portugal was conquered by the Visigoths and other German tribes, and the Jews remained here. They lived in every city and town, and in most of the villages as well. In 711, the Moors came up from North Africa, the Berbers, if you want to use the modern term, and they conquered the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal. Again, the Jews stayed on, living under Muslim domination or governance, and traded with their Muslim neighbors and lived in fairly peaceful times with them. Christians began what is called the Reconquest, coming down from the north and east to take over Spain and Portugal again. Lisbon fell to the Christian troops in 1147. All of Portugal, the southern province, was the last to fall in 1249. So now we have Christians ruling over the country. And strangely enough, because I'm going to be talking about a pogrom, the history of Jews under Christian domination from this period is largely peaceful. Isaac spoke about the riots of 1391 across Spain, in which the Jewish communities were decimated and many synagogues were destroyed, and the Jews were either murdered or converted or emigrated abroad if they were able to do that. 1391 did not affect Portugal. The riots did not occur here. So it was a largely peaceful time for them, which was why the massacre came as such a huge, huge shock. Now, the peaceful existence of the Portuguese started to come to an end in December of 1496 when King Manuel I ordered the Jews to leave, expelled the Jews. Why did he do this? Because he cut a deal with Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. He agreed to kick the Jews out in exchange for their daughter's hand in marriage. It didn't work out that way for King Manuel, but obviously he wanted to inherit Spain as well. But the Jews really never left Portugal. They didn't follow the expulsion order. Why? Because 3 months later, in March of 1497, King Manuel invited the Jews to the ports of the country, to Lisbon, Porto, Faro, and others, and said he'd have ships waiting for them to take them to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was welcoming the Spanish and Portuguese Jews with open arms. He said he would have ships waiting, but it was a trick. All the Jews came to the ports, and in Lisbon alone, 20,000 Jews were corralled behind one of the royal palaces and forcibly converted. They were forcibly baptized. If they didn't agree to baptism, they were either murdered or had their children taken away from them. So in the end, a new class of citizen was created in Portugal called New Christians, or conversos, or if you've probably heard a negative term, a pejorative term called marranos, meaning swine. And so it was a total disaster for the Jewish community. Why? Number one, at the time, it was impossible to think of yourself as a secular Jew, or very difficult. So everybody identified themselves with Jewish practice and ritual. So having to convert to Catholicism was a total disaster for them. Second, before the conversion, the Jews had autonomy in Portugal. They were not subject to the rules of the Catholic Church. They lived in what I call autonomous islands. So they had their own schools, obviously their own synagogues, their own courts, and they could decide their own community practices and projects. So once they accepted baptism, they lost all that autonomy and they lost their books. The books, the Old Testaments, the prayer books, they were all confiscated. Now, the king realized that you can't abracadabra change Jews into Christians overnight. He gave them 20 years to lose their Jewish customs. They were not supposed to be practicing them, of course, but they had 20 years before they would be persecuted. This didn't happen. In 1506, as I say, in April, during secret Passover celebration, secret because you could no longer practice Judaism openly. You were supposed to be a new Christian. A riot broke out. A riot broke out because of plague and drought and some specific events that occurred at St. Dominic's Church. St. Dominic's Church, which is on Lisbon's main square, the Rocio. I can talk more about exactly what happened there if you want. But because of this fervent, difficult atmosphere of plague and drought, Dominican friars went throughout the city calling death to the Jews, death to the heretics. And they were followed by a mob, and somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 new Christians, they weren't Jews now, they were new Christians, were murdered and taken to the Rocio, the main square, and burnt in 2 pyres. We know exactly what happened to them because of contemporaneous accounts. We even know that the wood to burn them was paid for by sailors from Northern Europe, for instance. Now, when I discovered this event, while researching a novel that I wanted to set in Lisbon in the 14th or 15th century, I was horrified, of course, because no one had ever spoken to me about it in Portugal, where I had many friends. And I asked my friends, architects, lawyers, doctors, teachers, what do you know about the Lisbon Massacre of 1506? And they all said, what massacre? There was no massacre. Doing a little research, I discovered that this pogrom had been excised from official histories of Portugal, was not included in school manuals. It was almost completely forgotten. Now, it happens that I have an extremely subversive personality, and when other people would prefer to forget a crime against humanity, I have become enthusiastic about forcing them to recognize these crimes committed in our name or in the name of God. So I did a year of research to find out about daily life in Portugal, what people wore, what they ate, etc. I did 2 years of writing, and then no one wanted to purchase the book. 24 New York publishers turned the book down. They all said it was wonderful, dramatic, based on true events, but it wasn't going to sell. Because those of you who are viewing in from America know that we Americans tend to view the world is starting in Maine and Florida and ending in California. So Lisbon in 1506 was way off their radar. I had a crazy idea, which was to show it to a Portuguese publisher, the book, the manuscript written in English, and it was accepted and it came out in translation. So my career is a bit upside down because my first novel came out in translation in 1996 in April, exactly 490 years after the massacre. And my publisher warned me that it could be a disaster because this was a taboo event. All of Jewish history was taboo in Portugal. And possibly my book could sell 0 copies and I could face reprisals in the press. That didn't happen. Almost right away, the book went to #1 in the bestseller list and created a sensation in Portugal. But I don't want to talk about the book so much or my success with it. I want to go back to the pogrom and its consequences. Although I will say there's a monument to the 2,000 to 3,000 new Christians who were murdered in Lisbon. If you come, you can see it. And the people at City Hall have told me it's all thanks to my book. So of all the books I've written and all the things I've done in my life, I'm perhaps proudest of having changed a culture and forced people to recognize this crime against humanity was committed here. Now, what happened? What were the consequences of this event? The Jews either went underground, in other words, they wore a Catholic mask in public and practiced their Judaism totally in secret at home behind locked doors and closed curtains, or they tried to emigrate. It wasn't as easy to emigrate as we think. Now, in this age of passports, we think, well, anyone could just get on a boat and go. No. If you didn't have a letter of authorization from an official saying you had a right to be on that boat leaving for the Ottoman Empire or Italy or North Africa, you would be arrested. And anything you were carrying with you, such as Old Testaments or prayer books, would be confiscated. It was very difficult to get out. They couldn't cross the border into Spain because the Inquisition in Spain had already started in 1486. What happened then? 30 years later, the definitive end for Judaism in Portugal came when the Inquisition was instituted. What was the Inquisition's purpose? It was to catch new Christians, not Jews. There were no Jews in Portugal, new Christians who were backsliding, who continued, for instance, to wash their sheets on Friday afternoon before the Sabbath. Or maybe they whispered a Hebrew prayer when passing a synagogue that had been confiscated by the church. For any of these infractions, you would be arrested, you would be tortured. And why were you tortured? To elicit a confession of practicing Judaism. But not only that, so you would name names. You would say, yes, I, Richard, was practicing the Sabbath ceremony in my home, and I had my brother-in-law there and my 2 children. Then the brother-in-law and the children would be arrested, and the same process of torture would continue. It was also a money-making scam for the Catholic Church because all your assets, your home, your farms, your donkey cart, everything would be confiscated and given to the church. So in consequence, what happened is the Jews who stayed over the next 2, 3, 4 centuries either went totally underground and never discussed their faith with anyone outside their immediate family, or they became good Catholics. And that's what happened to many of them. Now, one of the results I said of this was that they would emigrate. And so we have the Portuguese Jewish diaspora, which at first was in the Ottoman Empire because the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire welcomed the Jews with open arms to his territories. So they went to Istanbul, making Istanbul the largest Jewish city in Europe, to Izmir, to Salonika. Salonika was a majority Jewish city until the 20th century, when 95% of the Jews living there, the Sephardic Jews living there, were murdered by the Nazis in Auschwitz and other camps. So we have this huge Jewish diaspora that eventually ended up in Brazil, England, even in the United States. If you research the Jewish community in Charleston, for instance, and you look at all the names, they're almost all Portuguese names. Now, I just want to end with one last story. I have a very brief time. That this massacre was almost completely forgotten until I wrote the book, and there are still some people in Portugal with power, economic and political power, who would like to forget about this event and deny that it occurred. A few years ago, I was invited onto a very popular TV program to go to the St. Dominic's Church where this riot, this pogrom broke out, go inside and be filmed talking about the massacre and its consequences. 2 weeks before our filming, the television journalist called me up and said, we have to cancel the event. I said, well, why? I'm prepared. And she said, because the Cardinal of Lisbon won't let you, Richard Zimler, into the St. Dominic's Church to talk on film about the massacre. He would prefer that no one know about it. So it's just as a warning that there are crimes against humanity committed in all countries, and we, the novelists, the good journalists, the good historians, have a responsibility to make sure that everyone who reads and watches TV and listens to the radio knows about them, so that hopefully we can prevent such massacres being committed in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your remarks and for everything you do in striving to preserve the memory of the 1506 massacre in Portuguese society and the wider Jewish world. Our third panelist is another good friend and colleague of Jewish Heritage Alliance, Ms. Flor Hassan Nahum, the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. She is currently Special Envoy for the Foreign Ministry of the State of Israel. She will speak on the impact of October 7th on Israel and the world's reaction to it. And Flor, may I just add, we're very appreciative that you're here, especially as you have to leave in 20 minutes for a live interview on Fox News. So Flor, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Thank you, Michael, and the wonderful speakers that came before me. As a Jew from that region, it always warms my heart when we actually keep the memory of the suffering of the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula alive, that we don't forget it, that we had a beautiful heritage there, but we also have a brutal exit from there. And so having been born in Gibraltar and raised in the region, I'm very grateful always when we talk about the history of the region. So today I've been asked to talk about a little bit about what's going on in the world today, post-October 7th, and what does the anti-Semitism look like today, and what is the legacy of that anti-Semitism in terms of the subject that we're talking about, in terms of the pogroms of the past. And so first, I'd like to say that in the way that I see things, and I think the way we should all be seeing things, is that post-October 7th, what we're seeing, and it was coming before October 7th, of course, it's been coming for a long time, but after October 7th, the masks of the anti-Semitism of the day, which was anti-Zionism, which fooled many people into thinking that what they had against Israel was against Israel's political ideology, was against Israel's as a certain government from this side of the political spectrum, on that side of the political spectrum. What for many years people, anti-Semites, who very manipulatively tried to convince us that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and that the Jewish people and the land of Israel could be separate. And that is really part of the tactic. And unfortunately, I have to say, many Jews fell for this. Many Jews would go, I mean, not many, we're still talking about a very minority of Jews, but I'm particularly concerned about the young people who were literally convinced that it's Israel that people had an issue with and not the Jewish people. Now, if something good has come out of the horrors of the massacres of October 7th is that the masks are off. And now we can really talk about what we have in front of us, which is another version of the same hatred. In other words, like Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs would say, anti-Semitism is a mutating virus, and therefore it actually shapes itself into the scapegoatism and to the hatred and to the zeitgeist of the day. And today, the zeitgeist is, let's talk about the Jews as brutal white colonizers, because of course, when the world is saying that the biggest evil in the world is colonization, which the big Satan, of course, is the United States, along the way, Britain, somehow Jews who have been colonized about 200 times, somehow we are now the perpetrators. The inversion of reality is part of the very pernicious nature of the shape-shifting form that is anti-Semitism. And so what happened after October 7th is that even 24 hours after the massacre, even as the massacre was ongoing, even as the terrorists were still running free, we had around the world demonstrations blaming Israel and blaming Jewish people for whatever was happening in the Middle East, even though it was being done to us. This is really the nature of anti-Semitism. It's the inversion of the truth. They massacre our children, then they say that we massacre their children. And that's how it goes. Now, to me, this is just one more of the long line of blood libels that started, thousands of years ago. The first recorded incidents are somehow in England in 1000 AC. But of course, the Spanish and Portuguese reality of blood libels was all too raw. It was the little boys, the Jewish boys poisoning the well. It was Jews take the blood of Christian children to make the matzah. And over and over and over, and anytime something happened, the scapegoats were always the Jews. And so at the moment, we have anti-Semitism, classic anti-Semitism, that has shape-shifted into Israel being a white, brutal colonizer, and the victim is the Palestinians. Now, so now because we have a country, anti-Semitism is now not against the Jewish individual, but against the Jewish collective. We saw snippets of that in history of Jewish communities being accused of all sorts of things, but now we have a country. And so that anti-Semitism has turned against the Jewish nation state. That is what we see. And that is how we see the charges come against Israel. So even though we were the victims of a massacre, we are now baby killers. Sounds familiar? Of course it is. It just keeps the same type of blood libels alive. And of course, these blood libels that have been perpetuated by the mainstream media, by many politicians, by academic campuses, are actually dangerous and have created a situation where anti-Semitism has gone up by thousands of %. I can't even tell you each different country, but we're looking at hundreds to thousands of % increase in anti-Semitism around the world, because the world has taken the Jew as a collective, as a nation state, and now accusing it of everything else, not just that is going on in the world, but what has been done against us. And this is something which is reminiscent of all of the different generations, except that now we're a country and it's targeted against us as a country. So I have identified the 3 ways that we're seeing anti-Semitism play out today. And of course, happy to take questions afterwards. But the first is in the global so-called legal institutions. We see it at the UN, we see it at the International Criminal Court, and we see it in the International Court of Justice. So the UN is very, very clear, because we've been seeing this for years. We are a country that basically spans 0.02 of the world's population, and yet 75% of all of the UN resolutions against a country are against Israel. It actually beggars belief that we have an institution that is supposed to be representing the world, but what it's doing is whitewashing real, brutal, genocidal dictatorships, and yet putting all of their energy in condemning a free, democratic, liberal country that protects minorities. And the whitewashing of the dictatorships, and at the same time, the double standards applied on Israel, that together is the main picture of lawfare, but essentially anti-Semitism by legal means. You could call it another version of the Dreyfus trials, but again, not individually, now as a country. It's the same thing, but we are being demonized like Dreyfus as a country. And again, all of this is pernicious. All of it is, of course, completely absurd. And essentially what the world is telling us through its legal courts and through its international institutions is well, the Jewish people can have a state, but you don't have the right to defend yourself in the state, which is basically trying to delegitimize the existence of our state by taking away any type of tools to defend ourselves from brutal enemies who want the destruction of our state. So that is what we see. And then you see other international organizations like the Red Cross that don't bother at all with protecting the rights of Jews. Of course, we know that from the Holocaust, when the Red Cross went to Auschwitz and said, there's nothing to see here. But now we see that the Red Cross have done absolutely zero to try and see our hostages, pass medicines to our hostages as if we don't exist. And again, it's the other side of this very horrible lawfare international institutional coin of targeting Israel, of ignoring Israel, and of whitewashing everybody else, including the countries that have actively tried to destroy Israel. The second type of current anti-Semitism we see very, very obvious since October 7th is what's going on in academic campuses. And that is really a combination of a very toxic woke culture. I like to explain what woke is because I don't think people understand how deep-rooted it is. But woke culture essentially is something that was born out of a communist propaganda pamphlet that talks about the oppressor and the oppressed. And they've kind of applied it to America. They've applied it to a system of victimhood where the oppressor is, in its original form, of course, the imperialism of the United States, and the oppressed are any minority that somehow has been subjugated by the United States, except that the Jew can never be the oppressed, because woke culture sanctifies victimhood, which means a people that have been the most persecuted in history of the world, I think I can safely say, in every different form, those people, if they've gotten themselves out of it, if they've brushed themselves off, as we always do, look forward, come out of a genocide and build their own country, immigrate to countries such as the United States with nothing, with $2 in our pockets, and become very successful from sheer hard work. That has the American dream, essentially, meritocracy, in the woke culture no longer exists. And so Jews who rely on meritocracy to get ahead, because everywhere we go, we work hard and we get out of our victim status and we look forward, and then we succeed, and then we contribute, and then we make the world better, and then we're productive, we are fertilizer. That does not appear in the woke culture, because woke sanctifies victimhood, which is the anti-American dream. It's the anti-meritocracy. It's the DEI philosophy that people, because of the color of their skin, or because of their background, or because of their DNA, or because of their genetics, deserve a free pass, whereas Jews are the opposite of that culture. And so in this woke scale, the Jew is just a little bit above the white man. And so first of all, they've basically ignored that there are Jews that belong to different ethnicities, from Black to all the colors of the rainbow. Jewish people fall under, completely ignoring, of course, Jews from Arab lands. But more than that, taking victimhood, sanctifying it, and saying, well, the Jew could never be the victim because you're too successful. And so that kind of communist, originally communist ideology has seeped into academia, helped by a lot of money from the Soros to the Qataris, in order to villainize Jews and Israel as the Jewish nation state. So that is the atmosphere in the academic campuses, which has, of course, spread to students that have been funded and pushed from Iran, Qatar, and Soros in order to essentially create a new world order that sees America failing, or sees America as the opposite of a meritocracy. And of course, the Jewish people are the essential, quintessential, successful, rule the world, all the stereotypes, rule the communications, rule the banks, and all those stereotypes that we see are very much fit in to this woke culture because Jews work hard and succeed in many of the things that we do. And the third, and this is something nobody wants to talk about, is jihadi anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism found in the Muslim world. A few years ago, I did a panel with Deborah Lipstadt and with Jonathan Greenblatt and Noah Tishby, and everybody was talking about anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right, and everybody forgot to mention that there is subsidized anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, starting from countries that have peace with us, like Egypt, who have always kept anti-Semitism very much as a way of scapegoating their own incompetent rulers into Israel and the Jews, in their programs, in their culture, in their music, in everything you can imagine. And of course, in jihadi ideology, in the Palestinian school book, in the the way that education is taught in many of the Arab countries. And if there's one little light at the end of this tunnel, is that 12 years ago, the UAE took anti-Semitism out of its school curriculum. 2 years ago, Holocaust education was added to the UAE school curriculum. And 3 years ago, the Saudis took out very biased anti-Semitism out of the school curriculum. But notwithstanding some of the progress being made in the Islamic world, anti-Semitism is a given. Nobody even talks about it. And none of the organizations fighting anti-Semitism talk about it, because it's almost like they get a free pass because Israel has a conflict with the Arab world. So you get a free pass to basically perpetuate Jewish stereotypes and perpetuate anti-Semitism. It's somehow allowed. And so this is the shape that anti-Semitism takes today. And like I tell everybody I speak to, ultimately, it's the same anti-Semitism. It just shape shifts, and it creates a situation where today Jewish people of all ages are scared to be in certain arenas and are excluded from many arenas. So I'm very, very pleased, and thank you very much for organizing this so that we don't forget that all of this has very deep roots, especially in my neck of the woods and where I was raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora, very much for sharing your thoughts and a comprehensive overview of the many and varied ways that anti-Semitism can take, including, of course, today. Our last, but certainly not least, panelist is Professor Stephen T. Katz, a scholar, philosopher, and prolific author. He is founding director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies at Boston University and the Alvin J. Slater and Shirley Slater Chair in Jewish and Holocaust Studies. And he will share some thoughts on anti-Semitism in the United States post-October 7th. Professor Katz, thank you very much for being here. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Very fine talk we just had on Islamic anti-Semitism. Reminds me to start by pointing out that everybody looks for definition of anti-Semitism. The right way to approach it is to realize that anti-Semitism is anything you don't like. In a communist country, you're a capitalist. In a capitalist country, you're a socialist. In a racist country, you're of the wrong race. In an economically divided country, you're the oppressor, you're the victimizer. So you don't look for something except that anti-Semitism is always things you oppose. Anything you dislike, that's what the Jew is. Secondly, I want to point out to everyone that anti-Semitism is a peculiar phenomenon. It's peculiar in the sense that it's not like other kinds of stereotyping, other kinds of hatred, though it shares elements. But when the element of anti-Semitism is deconstructed properly, you realize that whereas most hatreds against other groups are above pushing down on the people at the bottom, they're lazy, they're ignorant, they're unproductive, they're uncreative. What's so remarkable and so terrible about anti-Semitism is that it's a success story that is opposed. Jews are too powerful. Jews are too strong. Jews are too smart. Jews are too rich. So it makes the kind of struggle with anti-Semitism a very different struggle than just another case of prejudice. Thirdly, I would point out that with regard to Jews, you have a very peculiar phenomenon. It's not always ordinary worldly dislike of people unlike yourself. My great teacher, Salah Baron, used to say anti-Semitism is the dislike of the unlike. But he missed something deep in this issue, namely that anti-Semitism also involves what I might call a metaphysical issue. Jews are guilty of deicide, killing Christ, killing God. Jews are also connected with the devil, they're diabolical. Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 43. Jews are also the subject of all kinds of fantasies. So, for example, the Georgia representative to the current House of Representatives, Marjorie Greene, actually said and believed that Jews control the weather. And earlier, she said that Rothschild money was used to bring people from outer space to spread COVID. These are extraordinary things that need to be appreciated. So in dealing with anti-Semitism, whether in the United States or elsewhere, you're dealing with something very peculiar. The second thing I would say is that in America specifically, we have a new phenomenon which we weren't used to. American history, with the exception of the immigration laws of the 1920s, which led to the 30s and 40s connected to the Shoah, the fact is America has been quite a good history regarding the welcoming of Jews, Jews already from the colonial period serving in offices, serving in the night watch, being representatives of their colonies, the colonial parlays. But the fact is that America now is going through something it hasn't really known, at least this generation. It's been a golden age since World War II. And to do the right things with regard to America, you have to understand that the face of America is changing. It's very important. Unfortunately, there's a very high level of anti-Semitism in the Black community. You have Black Lives Matter, which is extremely hostile to Jewish interests. You have the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, related phenomenon. You have other kinds of DEI, which is always hostile to Jewish interests. The US government is now supported by over $1 billion DEI programs under Biden, and all of that money has certainly had a negative Jewish effect. Secondly, we have a very large number of immigrants coming into the country. It's a sign of American history that we welcome immigrants, but it also needs to be borne in mind that immigrants bring with them the prejudice of their home country. So if you have large-scale immigration from Arab countries, if you have large-scale immigration from Catholic countries in South America, you're going to have an increase of anti-Semitic sentiment. Surveys suggest between 20 and 25% of immigrants coming to the United States hold negative views of Jews. Also, you have all kinds of new phenomena in the American community. The Hispanic community is hostile, the Black community is hostile, and the Muslim community that's just recently been created really in the last 50 years in the United States. And we see how important that is. The organized Muslim community is part of the funding mechanism for all of the activity on campus, for all of the anti-Semitism in the Congress, for all of the various activities that go on. So CARE, the big Muslim organization, and people like Ilhan Omar and Talita Rashid, this is the spear of a very significant phenomenon. We saw in the last election that it was almost the case that Dearborn, Michigan turned the election, and we saw how Muslims and others opposed Shapiro to be the vice president because he was pro-Israel. So the growing influence is very important. Also, I won't repeat what was said about the woke left, very profound and important subject by the previous speaker. In addition, we have Christian on the right, we have Christian nationalism. White Christians are talking about replacement theory, that Jews are at the heart of a plan to replace whites by Jews and other minorities. The striking idea, it's hard to disconfirm. We also have in America a very powerful BDS movement. BDS, Boycott Israel, is a very powerful, perhaps the most significant anti-Semitic group in the United States. In addition, college campuses has been described are hostile, the center of DEI. We have social media. We haven't talked about it. If there were time, we would have to explore the radical anti-Judaism, the radical Judophobia, anti-Israelism. that takes place without any kind of censor, without any kind of construction controlling it on social media. In addition, we have to understand that was said about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. You can make all the distinctions you want in theory. And it is important to say that logically there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But as Martin Luther King got it right, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, anti-Semitism is the real issue when one talks about the state of Israel. No matter what Israel would do, there would be a hostile reaction to it. So you have this whole list of long issues percolating in the American Jewish community, creating dissonance, creating anti-Jewish feelings, seeing the Jews as a new kind of victimizer, oppressor, hater of other groups, negative images. Here, I should say, this is very difficult. I don't have any simple answers. Fighting anti-Semitism, and the reason it hasn't gone away for 2,000 years, is very, very, very difficult because you're trying to disconfirm a myth. And how do you disconfirm a myth? How do you satisfactorily disconfirm all the canards, all the lies? However, I would propose that we needed to have two things. We need to have a very awake, very aggressive Jewish community. We have to have a zero tolerance policy towards all of the kinds of things that are done, where the American Jewish community has given a free pass to too many things. And secondly, we need to have a leadership that is willing to take the fight on. Until very recently, the American Jewish leadership has not done that. So we are confronted with new issues, new challenges, and I hope we will have some success as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Katz, and indeed to all of our panelists for their remarks. We now enter the discussion and Q&A session of our program. As a reminder, if there are questions from the audience or any more than have already been submitted, please put them in the Q&A box. I don't know if, I guess, Flor had to leave, but we'll start with a few specific questions, but everyone please feel free to chime in and add their thoughts as well. I guess going off, we'll start with, as Professor Katz just finished, talking about the need for an aggressive Jewish response. I guess the question is, what do the panelists or other panelists, including Professor Achayun or Richard Zimler, what do you propose? Is that something that is needed by all Jewish communities? What can we all do collectively to try to push back at this terrifying time, this rise of anti-Semitism around the world? So that's certainly a question for anyone if they'd like to chime in. And second, I'd just like to ask too, I see personally myself two responses, it seems, in many cases. One is that there is that talk to try to openly be proud, to showcase our Jewish identities and symbols, of faith, etc. On the other hand, it seems in some countries there's now, a great fear of doing that. There is a culture of fear, and so in a way, is it even a resurgence of crypto Judaism? Could we say? Around the world. So these are questions to anyone on the panel.
I'm no expert on anti-Semitism around the world, but I'm a great believer in education. And so I think people, kids, students, everyone needs to be educated about the history of Jews as well as the history of other religions. I studied comparative religion at university at Duke. And so I know a little bit about the mythology and the history and the legends and the doctrines and the rituals of Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism. And I think that's a big help. When we learn about these other religions and the history of other peoples, we stop having these incredibly destructive fantasies and conspiracy theories about what Jews are or what Muslims are or what Buddhists are. And so if it were up to me, if I were a Secretary of Education or a Minister of Education in any of these countries, in the Arab countries, in America, in Brazil, in Latin America, I would insist on having not religious studies to indoctrinate people, but studies about the history of religions, about the history of Judaism, what its people have done, what its people have suffered, where they live, what they believe in, what their costumes are, what their traditions are, etc., etc. Because I don't believe that just telling people stop disliking Jews or stop spreading conspiracy theories, I don't think that's going to help at all.
Yeah. Yes, I do agree. I do agree with you. Of course, everything is up to education. You can't just start and blaming other people for anti-Semitism instead of educating them and telling them the story. I have to, for example, really to mention, for example, Morocco. The kingdom decided to teach the Jewish history in all the school systems in Morocco. And I believe that the new generation will learn a little bit some facts, some figures and numbers, and will study something. Of course, there is always the propaganda in the TV and the media, etc. So, of course, I believe only education, especially our students. Let's start with our Jewish students. They know nothing. There is no response from them. And about the other question about being aggressive. Of course, we have to be aggressive. And especially last week, on Friday, I met Mr. Avi Cohen, who is the general director of the diaspora department in the Israeli government, and also combating anti-Semitism. And I asked him, do you see any influence? Do you see any impact, for example, from some responding, let's say, very famous Arab active, his name is Yosef Haddad, maybe you heard about him. He said, unfortunately, there is no real impact because he is living in Israel, and the story and the facts and the numbers that he's trying to bring, as long as they are coming from Israel, there is no impact, there is no influence. If you compare it, for example, to Brigitte Gabriel in the States, and she's very aggressive by attacking all this false propaganda about ethnic cleansing, and she bringing facts and numbers, and he told me they see now the impact and the influence of her video. There is nothing to compare to other videos. In other words, when you take some videos, especially from when you talk somebody who lives in the States, like Brigitte Gabriel, I do believe that if she's bringing some facts and numbers and attack directly, we can see that there is some kind of impact and some changes. But again, as we said in the beginning, first, start with our community, start with our students, all the campus. Try to teach them to be aware of the Jewish history, that they could stand in front of other people and to respond to them, not to run away, and especially not to reach a situation in which some Jewish students are pro-Palestinians and are doing making a lot of damage to our image, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Katz.
Can I just add, the remarks about education by Richard and by our Israeli colleague are complicated. You know, we've spent since World War II literally billions and billions of dollars on Holocaust education. And we've introduced it in America by mandate in a lot of the states as an official part of the curriculum. and yet it has not done the job. So while I'm in education as you are, I have to say we have done a very poor job of knowing how to teach what needs to be taught. And I want to double down and reemphasize what was just said. Our day schools do a terrible job of doing Jewish education. You get of Jewish history, you get kids out of 12 years of day school, come to my classes at the university, have no knowledge of Jewish history. It's a very serious issue. Moreover, the question is, what kind of education works? Teaching them the facts, that there was a Treblinka, that there was a Sobibor, is that enough? What do you have to teach them to move their neshama, to move their souls in the right direction? This is very complicated. And one of the things I meant when I said aggressive, the Jewish community needs to go back to the drawing board and think about all of these issues. It has to have a very open possibility that we've been doing things the wrong way. I stress this especially to Jewish day schools. Very serious issue of how to do the right kind of education that will make people less prejudiced, less hateful, less anti-Jewish.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Very, very thought-provoking and an important conversation to be had. Richard, 1506 seems far away. It's over 500 years ago. But in a sense, it seems like it's ever present, especially since you wrote your book and brought it back to public consciousness. And there's a question from the audience about if it's translated into Hebrew, if your book is, if you could just talk about that a little bit. But also another question, Portugal's long prided itself on not really being anti-Semitic, perhaps we could even say philo-Semitic. But in the post-October 7th era, what is the current situation facing the Portuguese Jewish community? And is there any difference between Lisbon, Porto, and other cities?
The only book of mine that has come out in Hebrew is The Last Kabbalist to Lisbon. So if you read in Hebrew, please get a copy. As far as Portugal today, we don't have visceral anti-Semitism. We don't have the kind of anti-Semitic campaigns that still go on, fomented by the church in places like Poland. We don't have those wretched conspiracy theories, blood libels, nothing like that. What we have are associations of Jews with certain characteristics. So I will meet people who will occasionally say Jews are aggressive, Jews are wealthy, Jews, are cheap, that sort of thing. It's very irritating, but there's no what I would call Jew hatred here. It doesn't exist. There is a generalized phenomenon in Europe that extends to Portugal, however, in which people really don't understand the difference between a Jew and an Israeli, and that not all Jews are Israelis. And that becomes complicated because people like me, who are well known in their country, get insulted all the time for policies of Israel. And I'm not an Israeli, and I have no control over what Israel does or what the Palestinians do or anything like that. The Jewish communities are welcomed in both Porto and Lisbon, and we have a very small community in the Northeast Mountains in Belmont of people who used to be crypto-Jews. There's no difference here. I mean, everybody here knows I'm Jewish. I never have problems in the street. I would be happy if I were interested in wearing a yarmulke. It just is not a problem here in Portugal. October 7th, the far left-wing people in Portugal, I'm talking about communists and others on our far left, again, are anti-Israel from the perspective that they would say of colonization and oppression and occupation. It's not a racial hatred. It's not typical Nazi philosophy or even typical ancient or medieval Portuguese and Spanish policy. It's this association of Israel as being imperialist aggressor. That's gotten worse. There's been graffiti on the Porto synagogue. No one's that I am aware of has been threatened or hurt. So I still consider Portugal to be maybe the safest place in Europe for Jews, and maybe for Muslims as well. I mean, it's just generally speaking a nonviolent, safe country. The conspiracy theories here are very limited, and I hope it stays that way. But I'm a little nervous because I do study history and I do research history, and we all know that things can change in a very few years.
And speaking of that, Professor Katz, you had mentioned in your remarks too that American Jewish history, as we know, has long seemed exceptional, an exception to the story of anti-Semitism in the diaspora by and large. But of course, we're all living through these appalling scenes on college campuses and protests in front of synagogues, attacks on Jewish institutions or openly identifiable Jewish individuals in the United States. So I guess the question is here, do you believe that what we're going through right now in the post-10/7 era is an aberration in American Jewish history, or is this the new normal for the American Jewish community, as much as you can predict the future?
Predicting the future is always difficult. You know, in Stalinist Russia, he used to fix the old pictures to show things that weren't there. And the Russian historians used to say it's hard enough to predict the past. So one has to be cautious. I'm afraid that we're in for a long struggle here. And that's because the changing face of America that I mentioned is an ongoing reality. It's not something that's going to stop. So the character of the demography is going to continue to move in directions which I think are going to be very challenging to the American Jewish community. On the other hand, I must say, because people need to take this into account, at the same time that we've had this extraordinary hostility, and whatever one feels about the Biden campaign and Kamala Harris, the fact is Joe Biden got on an airplane and went to the state of Israel to show his support for Israel. Columbia University, which is the center of the storm of hatred on college campuses, at the same time all of the violence and all of the hate speech was being propagated, the students themselves elected an Israeli student to be the president of the student body. So it was not a very widespread phenomenon that included all the students at Columbia University. The Congress did have the courage, half courage, to criticize, censure, was it Talib, for remarks she made about Jews and the Benjamin Franklin, Jews and money. So of course I say half because they also had to include all the other prejudices to have the courage to mention anti-Semitism. So there's a lot going on in the United States which cuts both ways. And I think that the difficulty of the situation will be long-term. Moreover, it will in large part, I think, depend on what the Jewish community does. If the Jewish community continues to be rather timid, if it tolerates various kinds of accommodation, if it allows anti-Semitism to have mediators that are not rebuked, it will get worse. If our leadership and our community will get together in a more coherent way, which is not the case today, things might improve. So I think we have to wait and see, but be very cautious.
That sounds, yeah, very, I'm sorry, was there? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought someone had a comment. Professor Ochaiyun, apologies, you got cut off when you were speaking earlier. Couple questions for you, as much as you're able to speak. One, you know, of course, just 2-3 years ago, we all heralded the arrival of the Abraham Accords as groundbreaking for the region and the future of Jewish-Muslim relations in the region and really, I think, around the world. Has October 7th, especially as you live in Israel, has it changed the trajectory of the Abraham Accords at all? And has October 7th increased the number of Jews making Aliyah? Is there any one country where the majority of the Olim or the immigrants are coming from?
Well, as I heard right now is from France. There is more people, new immigrants coming from France because of the new situation, especially in France. It's not easy, it's not safe to walk in the streets these days in France. So I believe that we are going to see more and more Aliyah from France. It's up to the government, also the Israeli government, to prepare to make the right preparation for this aliyah, because we are talking about a different society. It's a very, very socialistic in France, in which everything is free education, and all the schools, all the activities, etc., etc., and the new immigrants from France are facing a lot of troubles because the school system in Israel is not really prepared for them. So I believe we are trying to encourage the Israeli educational system to prepare themselves for these immigrants from France. Talking about the Abraham Accord, we are discussing, we are talking with the representatives, especially, for example, if I take the ambassador of Morocco in Israel. So we are planning to have some kind of sharing conference. Meanwhile, just to bring the Arab professors from Morocco and other places to Israel. They are not sure that this is the right time, because the government and other foreign institutions, there is no problem. But the large crowd walking in the street, it's not so easy, and especially students now, and also students. So we hope that by the time, if we have a ceasefire in Gaza and other places, maybe in a year or two, we can see again the same situation with a better relationship with the Arab countries. But right now, it's not so terrible. But if for example, if you say Dubai or Morocco, but you can't compare it to a year and a half ago, where when all the Israelis were really welcomed and everybody wanted the Israeli tourists, etc., etc. Now it's very dangerous to walk in some of the streets.
Thank you for that, Flor. As you come back, I don't know if you heard the last question to Professor Ochayoun, but the question was, especially as you were on a previous JHA webinar in 22, connecting the golden age of Sefarad with the Abraham Accords. Has October 7th changed the trajectory of the Abraham Accords and, Israel's hopeful normalization with Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region?
So thanks for the question. I think it's a very important question. And I definitely believe that part of the motivation of October 7th was to derail, this was the Iranians wanted to derail the impending peace with Saudi Arabia that was literally on the cards at that given moment. And this is part of the reason why the timing of October 7th happened when it did. Have they achieved what they wanted to do? Well, in part, things are difficult and not as warm as they were in 2020 when I co-founded the UAE Israel Business Council and the Gulf Israel Women's Forum. There's a lot less tourism, but I'm actually very optimistic, and I'll tell you why. The Emiratis especially, they're in this for the long haul. They weren't in this for the propaganda. They weren't in this for any other reason that they made a strategic decision. They're sticking with it. Do they have issues with the Palestinian cause plays very well on the Muslim street? Of course it does. It does play well on the Muslim street, but the leadership is committed, and what the leadership does and says, the people go along with it. Now, how do I know that it stood the test of the very brutal October 7th and everything that has ensued? Because last November, after the October 7th attack, the Arab League met. The Arab League met to make 3 boycotts on Israel. One was to roll back the Abraham Accords, the other one was to sever diplomatic ties, and the third was to kick America out of the region with their military bases, etc. And the Abraham Accords countries actually stopped those boycotts from going through. They did not go through. So the Arab League could not pass boycotts on Israel and America because of the Abraham Accords countries. So let's start with the good news. Back in April, when the Islamic Republic of Iran attacked Israel, what happened that night? the Saudis, Emiratis, and the Jordanians helped Israel repel that crazy attack, which any other country would have taken as an act of war and gone to war, and we didn't. And they helped us. But what was meaningful wasn't that they helped us, was that 2 days later, they admitted that they helped us. In the Arab world, you have to understand that rhetoric and reality can sometimes be two different things. I'll just finish my point and say that in the Arab world, sometimes rhetoric and reality are different. And sometimes we have these diplomatic ties behind closed doors, but they have to keep a facade of not liking Israel. I think that the Abraham Accords, to me, are a beacon of hope. I believe that in the next year, what's going to happen is advanced talks with the Saudis to make peace with Israel. And I think today, actually, in one of my national security briefings, what I heard is an interesting idea. If other countries, if America can encourage other countries, such as Indonesia, who now have a new president, Oman, other kind of countries like that, Malaysia perhaps, to make peace with Israel, then it'll be a very natural thing for Saudi to make peace with Israel. And I do believe the Abraham Accords are one of the bright points that we can look forward in the region, especially with the weakening of the Islamic Republic of Iran, with Lebanon and Syria and everything else that's going on.
Thank you for that. So back to the question we're posing. So I mean, that kind of feeds into it. The Abraham Accords, building relationships, trying to normalize relationships. So in the post-October 7th world, for all the panelists, what is perhaps the best way? Is it to build relationships, especially say at an interfaith level? Does this help educate Jews and non-Jews on anti-Semitism? And ultimately, I think the Jewish people need assistance from non-Jews to combat this world's oldest hatred. So how do we try to reach out and get non-Jewish assistance ultimately in combating anti-Semitism as we move forward in the 10/7 era, or the post-10/7 era, I should say?
Well, first of all, I think we talked about education. It's very important to influence secular education and education in Christian schools. That's a very high priority, I would have thought, is revising the curriculum to allow for honest appraisal of the question of the Jews. So I would put that very high on the way we do it. I think also the Jewish community needs to encourage the use of the law against those who would attack us, defame us. We have to use shaming for those who say things they shouldn't say in public. We need to do politics in the right way. I must say AIPAC in the last round of elections was remarkably effective in getting elected pro-Israel candidates. And that should be a model for what we do with our dollars. So there are a lot of things we can do.
Yeah, well, thank you again for that, Professor Katz. I think we will continue to have these conversations. Thank you to the entire panel for joining us today, for giving your great insights. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. And the captivating webinar ultimately has shown that while anti-Semitism is seemingly eternal, alongside taxes and death, to quote Benjamin Franklin, so too is the resilience of the Jewish people. So happy Hanukkah to all who celebrate. And while we may live in dark times, there is still light and hope. Michael, I turn it back to you.
Thank you for an amazing discussion and insights. At the closing of my comments, which are coming back up in a moment, we will show the trailer of the movie, 1506, a Lisbon Genocide film. We'll also share with the audience the link for the full version. As we go to close, I must ask everyone, especially our dedicated audience, to please get involved and support our efforts and our work. We approach year end, and we ask all of you to please consider making a tax-deductible donation that will help support our work. And our work is varied and pretty wide in scope. One last thing before we go, I want to share with everyone and introduce Jewish Heritage Alliance Educational Journeys. One of the many ways in which we promote the saga of Sefarad is via these life-changing Jewish Heritage Tours. These are unique, specially designed tours and programs, each led by an academic expert. For additional information about our work, our upcoming programs, any questions you might have about our tours, please visit our website or send us your emails. And at this point, I thank everyone, and I'll ask Dave to please put on the trailer. Thank you, everybody.
Grazie a Dio.
Could a simple reflection of light have been the trigger for one of the most horrific genocides in Europe? In Portugal, ancient myths that linked the Jews to trickery acted as the spark of a bonfire, ready to burst into flames.
É judeu. Ele quer negar o milagre.
São eles, os judeus, que trouxeram esta desgraça!
It was ignited on April 19, 1506, in the streets of Lisbon. More than 3,000 Jews were murdered in a scenario of unimaginable inhumanity, where even babies were thrown onto the flames.
Lisboa está a sofrer terrível massacre.
The decline of the great Portuguese Empire had just begun.
Em nome do Altíssimo e da Santa Igreja, eu vos absolvo de todos os vossos pecados.
Once again, thank you, everyone. We will make the link for the full-length movie available to everyone who's here today. Thank you, and have a blessed day.